So what we will do? A good idea is to have a team. And probably you will need a database, you will need corpora, and you need standards and tools and more experts, more lexicographers, more collaborators, and very important, you need funding. And this is the best way we are trying to do, and probably we can call this smart lexicography. So this could be the history of this Portuguese dictionary, who knows? And in Portugal, in spite of the successive attempts of the Academy, only in the 21st century, more precisely in 2001, did the Portuguese Academy publish a complete dictionary from A to Z, only in the 21st century, in a 2-volume paper version, Dicionário da Língua Portuguesa Contemporânea. And in 2015, I was invited to coordinate this new project of a new dictionary for the Academy of Science. At this time, the main thing was the need for updating the content of the print edition, but I wanted a digital edition, and the data should be accessible, interoperable, reusable, using standardized open file formats such as TI, and of course, we were concerned about linguistic analysis. At the beginning of this project, we just had the PDF document corresponding to the print edition. And we work on this file and converted it to XML using P5 schema of the TI. But now, the new Portuguese Academy Dictionary is already in database format, but is only privately available. As Alberto Simões presented, we created a smart tool framework to support lexicographers' work that offers different types of tools, like smarts. And now we are working with Nova Clun, my center, and with Belgrade Center of Digital Humanities on the encoding of this dictionary. And we decided to follow the TI guidelines, especially because it has a specific model for encoding dictionaries. Well, the TI format, although very complete, presented some challenge. We could not find solutions in the guidelines that cover all the microstructural elements of the dictionary, and TI guidelines are very flexible because it contains multiple encoding possibilities for the same dictionary feature. So, in the original encoding, we adapt some of the TI P5 schema. For example, I bring this example, the preposition A in Portuguese, and if we look to the expressions that begins with the letter A and the Roman number, valores semânticos, value semantics, and expressão de valores locativos, expression of locative values. This is not a definition, but in the original encoding, we put this information in tag def element for definition. But now we are concerned about semantic questions and the structural organization of all the TI. So we are changing this now. And examples like this made us to look into eLex 0. eLex 0 is a new format, a streamlined version of the TI guidelines, and the schema is not fixed, so we can change it in order to accommodate relevant dictionary structures. And we also have been participating in the eLex 0 discussion on GitHub. It's a work on progress, and it's important to say that eLex 0 will not replace the dictionary chapter in TI guidelines. It's our goal to facilitate the integration of the existing lexical resource over the world. And here we can see some of the XML essential changing. So if you look, we had an entry, and now we will have the ID and also the lang attributes. And we encoded the lemmas as term, not properly correctly. So now we are using this form type equals lemma. And one of the remarks that I have to say about eLex 0 is that when we want to tag the part of speech, now we are using gram type pause for the part of speech, and we also could encode the gender. So now we have this difference, and a lot of them. Just here, the essential changings. And a basic structure includes of the Portuguese Academy Dictionary includes the following elements. We have an entry, we have the phonetic transcription, we have definitions, part of speech, and we also have etymology. It's just the basic structure, because this is a dictionary with a lot of information, with synonyms, with collocations, with antonyms, and notes, and this is only the basic entry structure. So the outermost structural lever of an entry is marked with the entry element that encodes all the information on the written and spoken forms of the head word. So we want to highlight, like I told before, that the entry requires the attributes XML, ID, and lang, and in terms of grammatical informations, we are using the universal dependence part of speech. So you can see here the qualification of an example of the TI encoding. Before we talk about our classification, I want to introduce the eLex 0 classification of interest. Main entry, related entry in TI, used for sub-entries, and the homonymic entry, and for the home element of TI guidelines. And we also have the word family that is used for root-based dictionaries like Hebrew or Arabic, or also etymological dictionaries. And we want to keep this because this is a eLex 0 recommendation. But when we're working on our project, we feel the need to use our own classification to optimize the lexicographic work. So now we are going to present our own classification, and we're going to present some experience on the encoding of the types of lexical units. So the first step, we listed all the entries of the Portuguese dictionary and identify all types of lexical units. And we have monolexical unit, polylexical unit, affix, and abbreviation. So in a monolexical unit, we can have the lexical units such as noun, adjectives, and also the grammatical units. And in a polexical unit, we include all the compounds and all kinds of lexical combinations. And in abbreviation, we have abbreviations, alphabetism, acronyms, symbol, contractions, and we also put in this classification the clipped forms. We can see here the attribute, an example of a monolexical unit. We have the word palacio, palace, on the Portuguese dictionary, and you can see that we have the ID on the entry, and we also have the attribute type and value lemma, and the element orthographic form gives the orthographic form of the head word. And we can't put our classification on the entry level. So we've decided to propose a gram group, gram type, with the value lexical with the type equals lexical construction, and our value, our classification. And this is the way to, this information just for us, for who is working on the dictionary. So this type of classification will not appear to the user, will not be displayed to the user. So because of that, we use this kind of encoding. And sometimes the lemma is a borrowed word. And in TI coding, a unit borrowed for a foreign language is identified with the element etym, where etymological information is encoded and labeled with the attribute type and the value borrowing. The other trick conversion in the interest etymology, in the encoding, sorry, is the etymology. Yeah, and I can explain this. It is challenging, mainly because when the PDF document was converted to TI, we didn't worry about this, all the portions of the information that brings an etymology. So we encoded like plain text. We just used the tag etym, and now we are fixing all these things and encoding every information that etymology brings. And we also include, because it's the result of the process, it's not a morphological analysis, we also put in this classification monolexical unit derivative lexical units. And this example also shows that when a specific inflected form is featured in the entry, it should be clearly defined as an independent form and having enough information about the inflected type. In this case, we have insunado, the masculine form, and insunada, the feminine form. And it's true, the XML is verbose, but we tried in this case not to repeat all the information, so you can see that we have form type equals inflected, and we just put here the classification, the brand type gender. We don't repeat this information then again when we are classifying the parts of speech. So this is a way to work structurally all the TI encoding. And we have also polylexical units, and this is very simple in this case. So here's an example of a compound, and the encoding is just the same. We just have to change, in this case, the polylexical unit. And we are doing this automatically. I'm working also with Alberto, and he's doing this automatical conversion of the original encoding to the eLex 0 encoding. And in certain dictionaries, such as the Portuguese Academy Dictionary, affix appears as headwords. And in this case, the headword carpo indicates that carpo can be used as both a suffix and a prefix. And brackets, if hyphens, play the role of label, signaling the morphological property of the affix. But they are not part of the affix itself. So, therefore, encode the affix itself in OR elements, while using the element to encode the hyphens in this case. So, you can see also the difference, because in the original encoding, we put all in OR. Okay. And here's an example of an acronym, and sometimes the dictionary also classifies the acronyms with part of speech in this case. So we have the classification in this case is abbreviation, but we also classify the word as a noun and with the gender, in this case masculine form. because we use this on our current language. And we also have a specific type of units that are clipped forms, and they are usually treated as nouns. And there is another detail in this entry that I want to highlight. It's the superscript number near the headword to differentiate the different entries that are registered on dictionary, Metro 1, 2, 3, and for this information we use the attribute number. And about homonyms, I want to also to highlight that eLex 0 scheme only allows entries. We don't use separator or elements like the TI guidelines recommend. So we only allows entry to be used to typeset of entries. And this task made it possible to evaluate the consistency of the data referring to the Portuguese Academy Dictionary print edition, and thereby highlighting content-related inconsistencies and ultimately contributing towards the optimization of lexicographic teamwork. And this is a work in progress, and further discussion how to encode most of the information properly is still needed. So eLex 0 is stricter than TI, but is fully capable. We are testing it, and we can say that it's fully capable of representing the complexities of the entry structure of the Portuguese Academy Dictionary. And it's true, like we saw on the example about insonado, the inflected form, sometimes the encoding is more verbose, but more structural, allowing machines to process this information better. And our goal is not to have the dictionary in eLex 0 only. We are keeping our own interpretation of TI. So we are testing and doing, but it's a challenge, but it's being very good to work about the structure of all the dictionary, to differentiate all the microstructural elements. And this is very good for us lexicographers. And we think an agreement between academies and other institutions would be desirable to systemize and optimize resources that can provide a better representation of the entire European lexicographical heritage. This is our dream. We hope come true. So thank you for your attention.
To corroborate on this subject. But what I wanted to say is that, to my experience, the main thing is to define a structure, to describe the real content of the dictionary. And to my opinion, maybe you should focus on your DTD schema of the dictionary and use TEI as, an export format or a format for communicating, for sharing to other websites, other projects, etc., but maybe not as a source format, if you understand what I mean. I'm not sure TI should be used as a source format, because the source format depends very much on the content of the dictionary and on the richness of the dictionary. So it's a struggle to make the dictionary fit into this format. So maybe we can use a richer description.
Thank you for the question. I don't know if I really understand, but I will answer. And for me, it's very important to work on the TI encoding, and I see this TI Lex 0 with a great opportunity to change things in TI guidelines that not are working for us lexicographers when are doing our work, because the schema is not fixed. So it's great for us to give our contribution, because we know that many times this type of work is doing not by linguists or by lexicographers or by experts of the dictionaries, and this is great for us to, with the experts of TI, discuss how is better to encode this. And now that I'm not an expert of TI, I'm just a lexicographer, but I'm doing a lot of training to understand and to improve, because I know that I'm a lexicographer, but things change. And when I started to work on lexicography, yes, it's true, I already work with a Word document to make dictionaries. So now that I have this opportunity, I think it's important, because we have to, the standards needs terminological and lexicographical work. And I feel that most of the case is, well, it serves, okay, go ahead. No, we want to improve all the work, the linguistically well structured and with a good terminology on this. But I understand what you are saying, and probably some years later I will tell you, oh, okay, no, I don't know to answer to that. But for me, and I'm not an expert for TI, but it is a great opportunity. And in the case of the Portuguese Academy, I also want to say a thing. It's very difficult to establish all the microstructural elements, and I told you why. Because there were a lot of collaborators, and sometimes they put different ways. And the way that they work on an Access database, now we have other tools, so we just had the PDF. And always when I'm encoding different entries, I'm always seeing, oh, this is different. They have another criteria. Do you know what I mean? Of course. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'm learning with that, and it's a great chance for lexicographers, linguistic terminologists to work on standards. So, yeah.
Before the conference, we had a workshop on multi-word expressions, and I gave a talk about defining what a multi-word expression is. I'm just wondering, you used the term polylexical. What exactly do you mean by that? How is it different from multi-word expression?
Yeah, we don't want to use multi-words expression, because what is a multi-words expression at all? And we want, yes, but we want to precise. And when we talk in Portuguese about multi-words expression, probably the experts will exclude the compounds, for example, and we don't see like this. So we are including all the phrasemes or the collocations with this. We think it's a more generic concept, and we have to look first to the concept and then to suggest the term. And this is what our decision. No, our point of view, and I told that it's just, we don't here, our classification is not a morphological classification. If I need to classify autocarro, I can look at the etymology to do this. This classification is only to help the review, the process of review of the dictionary. So in our case, our methodology that we are using to do the revision is important to the distribution of the work and to establish how many words we have from abbreviation, to control the vocabulary. Is just for this. It's not a morphological classification, no. just for a need. We have this need on the reviewing process, so we are using this. I hope I explained.
Okay, thank you. So, I'd like to thank our speaker again. Give us some chance to move between talks.
I don't know where is the mouse, sorry.
Okay, let's move on to our second talk, and Jack Bauer is going to talk about the TI encoding of a mixed text dictionary.
So this project kind of is like a little side task that I did in collaboration with my PhD colleague, Mohammed. I study a variety of Mishtek and work with TEI. For his PhD, he works on Groovy dictionaries, so I used the opportunity to encode a resource using his tool. Okay, so the overview of the source. So the source is from 1593, the Vocabulario in Lengua Mixteca. It was published by a Dominican monk, Francisco de Alvarado. And it's the first dictionary published with orthography in Mixtec. There were the variety is from Tepozcalula, Mexico. It's a Mixteca Alta variety. The entries were based on three earlier dictionary sources. One was the Castilian Nahuatl Dictionary, 1571. One was the Castilian Zapotec from 1578. And then those two were also influenced by the Castilian Latin Dictionary, which was the first dictionary of the Castilian language. And so they used kind of a template for vocabulary to collect when gathering and creating all three of these resources. Oh, why is that timed? Okay. So the PDF, so we took this PDF, and the version that we processed was a modernized version from Jansen and Perez Jimenez from 2009. The TEI dictionary that we created contains about 26,600 entries and related entries, and the structure is TEI Lex 0 compatible. I didn't put it exactly in Lex 0, but it's compatible. Okay. Why is this? How do you turn this? Okay. So here's the audience. Oh yeah. All right. So sorry. So here's a map of the Mixteca region where the language is spoken. The one on the left is the variety that I study and work with in the Huxtawaka district, San Juan Mixtepec, and the one the upper one is the variety of the dictionary that we'll be talking about. The region or the district now is currently San Pedro and San Pablo Tepozcalula. So there are multiple versions of this resource. It's gone through periods of revisions. The original, as I said, it was 1593. Then there was a facsimile reprint in 1965. The Mesolo project from Bakewell and Hammond in 2001 digitized the scanned copy of the facsimile and just created a text PDF version. And then Jansen and Perez Jimenez in 2009 did a whole reworking of this resource. They made it much more usable. The original source was it was Castilian, and then it had Mixtec terms, and it could have one or more senses. And it was just you would have to search it by Spanish, and then you would have multiple multiple Mixtec terms. It wasn't very well delimited. It wasn't very well conceptually organized either. And so what they did is they made a lot of improvements that made it much more usable, both from linguistic research perspective and then also much more processable from creating a structured digital resource from. Okay, so here's an example. So on the left we have the Mesolore version. So that's the first PDF version. This is one entry. So aceptar persona. And then on the right are Mixtec terms. And then on the far right are the revised versions. They create a Mixtec headword. They added font distinctions. They made the headword part bold. They added delimiters between senses, glosses, and then they added, so for example, you see futuro down in the second one. They put that in italic, and so they organize the information in a much more lexicographic or friendly way, so to speak. And then they also did things like the original version they didn't realize that the boundaries between words, morphemes, prefixes, etc. So they put it all together and they presented it as if it was an agglutinative language, which it's not. So the modern version separates it and created a much more linguistically accurate representation of this. And by doing all of these structural things, it made it really compatible for Groovy dictionaries, which identifies all these delimiters in order to use machine learning to create a structured output. Okay, so briefly on low resource languages, it's increasingly common and needed to use OCR for indigenous and low resource languages. There's lots of PDFs and old dictionaries that are at risk of being lost, and they're not being used because they're sitting in a physical form. And so now there's more work being done to try to use OCR to modernize these dictionaries. So Maxwell and Bills in 2017 did one for a few languages, created an XML output, and then Rainavo and Malanzon in 2017 also did some for several Malaysian languages, and they parsed it using a Python parser. And now I'll turn to Laurent to explain the Groovy dictionary details.
Thanks, Jack. I'm somehow representing Mohammed, who is currently writing his PhD, so think of him locked somewhere and doing the hard stuff. Some of you have heard about Groovy Dictionary, which is one of the components of a wider software suite dedicated to the automatic extraction of contents from PDFs into structured representations, obviously in TI. It's based on the idea that with simple cascading conditional random field models that you see there, where you've got several levels from the general dictionary segmentation, where you identify the page, the running heads, and then you segment the entries, and then further you segment the elements within the entries, like the headwords, the definitions, and so on, and down to a quite fine-grained level of granularity. You can get a lot of information. The power of conditional random fields there is that they can be trained quickly just with a few samples, and we shall see a few can be wide as what you would think sometimes, but a couple of pages you can actually get the models to converge and provide useful results. So what we've been doing out of the 26,000 pages you've heard of, entries you've heard of, we've done some training. So we've manually annotated 572 entries within which we identify various objects, as you can see on the screen there. So for most of the interesting elements in the entries, like sense, lemma, and so on, you could have a lot of occurrences, and so a good material for the training of the models. But for instance, you had some rare objects like the related entries, derivations. I'm not going to discuss the multi-word entry discussion here. But you see we had only 10 of them in the training data, and during the evaluation only 4 to recognize. So you can see that depending on the actual content you've got you can have some discrepancies in the identification there. This is reflected in the results, as you can see there. You see that for some components like lemma, we're very close to 100% identifications, which is very good for searching and as I would say a ground layer for further structuring. But for instance, you see we are at 0 for related entries for the reason I presented, because in the actual test sample, the related entries were by far more complex. Of course, you could say we could pursue the process and carry on annotating further examples, but since it was part of a complete workflow where the data had to be reshuffled somehow afterwards, as you shall see, that was not necessarily worth it. The elements, I mean, discussing that with Jack, that are very important, like, for instance, grammatical information that were well recognized, and of course all the punctuations, for instance, which allowed, for instance, the differentiation between multiple senses, multiple definitions in the entries. We got them quite well. And Groovy Dictionary is completely, I would say, standards compliant, because the output is aimed at providing a complete TI representation, which we also intended to make compatible with the general project that Jack is pursuing to have a, I would say, comprehensive description of the Mixtec language. So for instance, here you can see to the right the entry that was extracted from the dictionary and how it would match the left-hand side existing entry from your own dictionary. Do you want to say something in there?
Well, so I should just say in the classical Mixtec source, since there you don't know whether the sense is going to be like a gloss or it can be an explanation. We had to, by default, encode those as defs, and so that's why in the Mixtec version we use a translation, because it's clearly a translation. In the Mixtec TI dictionary, we can have definitions. Ideally, I want to work with my Mixtec colleagues to create Mixtec definitions, but we don't have much of that right now. And then I also added the domain and then the corresponding URI for the given concept, just to match up with between the dictionary structures.
And the next slide shows an interesting and I would say obvious in this context application of what we've been doing, because the actual entry extracted from the dictionary representing an older version of the language, even if from another region, can be used then to feed the general dictionary as an etymological background there. So you see the kind of mappings we've done from the entry on the one hand and the etymology description there, preserving some of the representations you've heard of, for instance, from the previous talk.
And I should specify that the variety, the Typoskogula Mixtec, the classical Mixtec, is not a direct parent language to Mixtec. That's why I don't encode that's not encoded as an etymon, it's encoded as a cross-reference. See this related form, it's clearly related as obvious by the forms themselves, but it's distinguish specifically in the data structure that I'm not misrepresenting it as a direct etymological relationship. Okay. So here's an example of just the kind of data that we want to collect. So all of this is represented in the Mishtek entry for the word head, is what this means. And then here are some of the cognate languages that I collect and put those in the in structured cognate forms in the etymology. And then to the right is the classical Mishtek. For some vocabulary, there was a historical there's a paper that reconstructed classical Mishtek, and so there's not too many, but for lexical items where there was a reconstructed version of that, I do have those in the dictionary as well. Okay, so to go over the kind of information that was parsed, so here on the left you can see one that has two separate senses that were divided by the semicolon, and Groovy Dictionary parsed that into two separate senses with one definition each. To the right is one with a comma, and correctly separated that into two definitions within a single sentence. These are the kind of things that were made available by the 2009 revision of the dictionary source. Again, so here's the inflected form. So where they have the futuro, they add that in italics. Again, I mentioned that enables the Groovy dictionaries to identify the given feature and to encode it as an embedded inflected form with the grammatical information. I added, using XSLT, anything that has a form inflected can easily be, you write a quick program to add the part of speech as verb, because it's always going to be a verb, obviously. And so there's collocates and usage. So here's so it's to sit up, and then in the round bracket says in the bed, and then the hint is a usage type hint in the bed. And so in some of the content the 2009 authors added modern Spanish translations, because Spanish was different in 1593, obviously, so there was some vocabulary that just didn't correspond. So they added vocabulary, and they would put it in a square brackets. And so where they do that, I have a clear translation structure that corresponds to the same way that I do the translation in the Mishtek dictionary. And then I add the responsibility statement, which corresponds to the declared individuals who have an ID. So here's a major feature that I want to work on. So in some of the cases, the original source actually declared that this is a metaphorical phrase, which is nice because I like to work on etymology. And so when this happens, I can create a structured etymology section in the TEI according to the exact same structure that I use in Mishtek. So this one, you need some expertise at least to know which part of the phrase is metaphorical. Ichi also is exactly the same form in Mishtek, so I know that is the metaphorical form, meaning road, and so it's to die, right? So it's a metaphor to come to the end of the road. So there has been need to enhance some of the output, but overall the results were really good. And the only reason why there's two main reasons why some of the things didn't process perfectly. One is a lack of sufficient training data. And then there were a few examples of even the 2009 version using the same distinguishing features, which still was human readable but wasn't distinguished in terms of training a machine learning set to make a distinction. So in those cases, we have to manually edit those. So briefly, potential future endeavors. I want to add English and then Mishtek translations with my Mishtek colleagues to this historical resource. And it would be great to use this as a cross-Mishtech language resource, which could be spread to other projects using studying and working with, creating resources for other varieties of Mishtech. There are, as I mentioned, there are two companion sources to this, the Zapotec and the Nahuatl dictionaries. It would be good to create TEI versions of each of these, and to then have these all in the same format, and then you can more easily systematically search where they correspond. And there's a lot of historiographical and anthropological and philological things that would be interesting about that. The kind of vocabulary they collected, cultural things native to the Mesoamerica. And then also there's a lot of vocabulary that was collected by the Dominicans who wanted to create vocabulary in the indigenous language, mostly for religious purposes. And it would be, so there's questions of how does each of them create these lexical items, these new items. And then one major thing that I've always been trying to put in Mohammed's head is to expand Groovy dictionaries to be able to scan a linguistic paper and automatically identify and extract and create TEI structured resources from linguistic examples of in a linguistic paper. I think there would be a very big market for that. So to conclude, Groovy can handle the vast majority of the work. There's a problem in fully standardizing this resource. There's issues like so there's no difference in the Spanish language tags for ISO 639 or any others that differentiate between the Spanish used in 1593 and the current Spanish, whereas that's not the reality of the language. So the standards aren't completely up to the task. And as I mentioned, there are in the source document, there are certain structures that didn't have enough information to create a machine learning success. And then this also goes to, it adds to the precedent of using TEI as a format that can be used for low resource languages and indigenous languages. To create compatible, user-friendly exports and output for people to work with.
Maybe I can add a word concerning, the way, since we've started with Groovy dictionaries now 3 years ago, the way it has changed our approach to many systematic projects like this one, because we come across a source and we don't say, okay, we need some further funding, like for 4 or 5 years to transform the dictionary into something useful. We just, Mohammed and Jack sitting around the table saying, okay, we've got a scanned version, let's extract the information, and it does work. So it has really reshuffled the way we contemplate accumulating heterogeneous sources. And the last remark that Jack made concerning, okay, let us now extract examples from existing descriptive books, for instance, is typically part of the project to see how we can enhance the suite even further. So thank you.
Okay, so time for a few questions.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Really quite inspiring. A couple of points or questions. First one was, wondered if you'd seen Sabrina's demo on language tags, because it gave a way of doing the private use, using the private use area to make a very specific tag for exactly the use you need.
Oh, no,
that was quite impressive.
Yeah,
I find it quite inspiring. And the other thing was just to try and get an idea of the amount of work involved in this and how it might scale up if you had, say, a few hundred different dictionaries, some of which would be images, scanned images, PDF rather than OCR.
Sorry, what was it?
So, how much work was involved in this manual work? How, if we had a few hundred of these to do, which we do, um, what might your recommendations be?
Well, you've seen the ratio, 500 entries out of 26,000,
So
and it
I
already
manually-
provides
yeah.
a lot of feedback. The experience in number of pages, maybe that's also a good count, is that I'm turning to several people in the room who have experimented with Groovy already. If you start by annotating 5 pages at the beginning out of a standard dictionary, you get a first level of convergence, and then you do a second round of annotation to identify which are the pages you should sample, which represent typical complex cases. And at the end of the day, between 10 and 20 pages, you can have something really exploitable at the end of the day.
So I manually annotated 500, those 500.
How long did it take?
I use some semi-programming to automatically structure these manually annotated things. But so he told me originally 300. I had to add some more because of all these diverse things. The most diverse things didn't end up being structured in the output anyway.
Roughly, time-wise, is that like a week's work, a month's
just
work?
a few hours.
A few hours. Okay, that's great. We can
Just for the record, we've developed an environment on Oxygen, the XML editor, in editor mode, so that with the style sheet you just move the segmentation lines, and so it's quite intuitive, if I may say so. Have you used that as well? I guess no, you've not. Even you've done that by hand. So, but he's a geek. So
that's great. Thank you very much.
Jack Halpern from the CJK Dictionary Institute. This is an extremely impressive project, and I hope it inspires others to do under-resourced languages. There are thousands of under-resourced languages. You probably know about PenLex, an organization that has covered something like 5,000 or 6,000 languages in the world.
Yeah, that's Alexis Michel.
They're based in California. And I just wanted to mention something. You kept on using the word definition and translation, and I don't know if you meant them to be used as synonyms or not, because normally these things are called equivalents or translational equivalents, whereas a definition is more like in a monolingual dictionary. What exactly did you mean by definition versus translation?
Okay, so translation, I meant translation equivalent. Definition is it's definition. It's an explanation of a concept of a term rather than direct.
So there are definitions. I thought that you were using them interchangeably. Okay.
No, because so I showed in the structure. So let's see, in one of the senses, they had to parse it in 2 different ways because so you see the ones in the source with the semicolon, those are separate senses, meaning different thing. Although that said, sometimes the source actually did put those in wrong areas, but we treat it as if they're all right. Occasionally they're wrong. So those are different senses, the 2 different sense levels. Those are glosses. Neither one of these are direct translations. There was one I showed earlier where he translated into modern Spanish the word incontinente into luego. But so that's the difference. The main difference between these 2 things, and then, as I said, the translation of incontinente to luego is a translation of the antiquated form into the modern form.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Another quick question? Okay, so we'll thank our speaker again.
What is your name again? Your name? Sina. So, remember, Yelena, why
Okay, so we'll move on to our third talk, who is going to take us from the TI world and bridge us into the Ontilex world. So Fahad Khan is going to talk about the example of Le Petit Larousse illustré.
Yeah, okay, it works. So today, as made clear by the title of my talk, my presentation, I'm going to talk about historical dictionaries as digital editions and connected graphs. And I'm focusing on a particular use case, and that's the digitization of a series of successive editions of a very popular French monolingual dictionary, namely Le Petit Larousse Illustré. And I would like to apologize in advance for my French, so my pronunciation will be terrible, but Laurent is one of my co-authors, so maybe if I'm really bad, you can come up and pronounce the word for me. Okay, so the work which I'm about to present is part of an ongoing project, the Nénuphar project, which is led by the Laboratoire Praxilang in Montpellier, and which also involves INRIA and ILC Pisa as collaborators. Nénuphar is an abbreviation, and it stands for Nouvelle Édition Numérique de Facsimilé de Référence. And it also means water lily in French. And so the aim of the project is to make key editions of the Petit Larousse Illustré French dictionary available in a digital format. For those of you who aren't familiar with the dictionary, it's an extremely popular and well-known dictionary in the Francophone world. In fact, it's regarded as something of a household item. It's been published every year since 1906, and most importantly for our purposes, it's a collective work, and so under French copyright law, all of the editions up to 1948 have entered the public domain, and that means that we can publish them, in this case, in an electronic form. So the Petit Larousse Illustré is a very useful resource, obviously, for understanding changes in the French language, but also in understanding changes in French society over the course of the 20th century. And one feature which is particularly useful in the latter regard is the inclusion of encyclopedic information in many of the entries of the dictionary, as I'll show you in the next slide. So, for instance, thanks to the Petit Larousse Illustré, we can trace changes in the orthography of words such as Nénuphar itself, which originally had two alternative spellings, and then it was spelled with a PH, and then finally with an F. We can also track changes in the pronunciation of different French words, such as Lecoise. And in addition, we can also learn a lot from looking at when specific words enter the lexicon, and also when they're no longer included in the lexicon. So, for example, the word Bosch entered the dictionary in 1918, probably as a result of the First World War. And in addition, and this is also kind of very interesting because, as I say, there is a lot of encyclopedic information, we can also track changes in technology and in scientific knowledge, for example, by looking at how the definitions of words such as aviation and hélicoptère change over the course of different editions of the dictionary. So this is probably can't see it very well, but this is a sample page from the first edition, the 1906 edition of the dictionary. And as I will explain later, these scans are actually available to download on the website. And the illustrations are also available as separate images. And so the text has been, for all of the editions which we've processed so far, the text has been OCR'd and then post-corrected through a process of computer-aided supervised post-correction. So now we're going to home in on one particular entry from the page which I just showed you, and that is the entry for verre, which is the French word for glass. And as you can see, the entry includes information on the pronunciation of the word. There's also grammatical information, such as in this case the fact that it's a masculine noun. And here there's also some etymological information for the entry, but this tends to be quite terse, so it's just the Latin etymon. And then we also have sense information, and unlike other more comprehensive dictionaries, there isn't actually any sense nesting, and this makes it makes the dictionary easier to model in TI and in RDF. And then there's also examples. For example, here, un verre de vin, sorry. And there's also related multi-word expressions. And then, as I said before, there's also a kind of an encyclopedic description of glass, and which describes, for example, how glass is obtained and how it can be worked and so on. It's the kind of thing you would maybe find in the Wikipedia entry for glass nowadays. So, in deciding on what approach to take in producing the electronic versions of different editions of the dictionary, we had three main desiderata in mind. Our first kind of desideratum was that related to the fact that we really wanted to reproduce the look of the printed page, and also to make it, to ensure that it would be accessible to a wider public, and also to hopefully ensure that we could preserve the kind of the visual look of the dictionary, and also because it is an illustrated dictionary, we thought this was quite important. But then we were also very eager to make sure that the linguistic, encyclopedic and historical content of the dictionary was encoded in a way that would make it more accessible to querying and also to other kinds of machine processing. And in addition, in order to adhere to the FAIR principles, which are that's an abbreviation which stands for acronym, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. We wanted to use standards or formats that had already had a wide uptake in the community, and this is to ensure that our data would be as interoperable and as reusable as possible. Luckily, there already exists a standard or set of guidelines that tick all of these boxes, and that is TEI, and especially Chapter 9 of the TEI guidelines. So what did we do in the end? Well, in order to make the visual aspects of the dictionary more accessible, we decided to make the dictionary available via a website with an HTML representation of the dictionary, and also to make the original scans downloadable. And then in our TEI encoding, we also, as with the JAX work, we decided to align our encoding with the standard, which has been proposed by the eLex working group. And this was for kind of two main reasons. The first is because we were very interested in maybe potentially integrating our resources into the eLex's platform. And then also because we were also very interested in using the Groovy tool, and that is also kind of fairly closely aligned with the eLex guidelines as far as I understand. In order to kind of make our resource as fair as possible, we are planning, we haven't, don't think this has been done yet, but we're planning to make the TI XML sources for each edition available on the Autoline repository. And we are also in the process of creating an RDF version of Le Petit Larousse, and we plan to do this by using the Untitled vocabulary, but I'll talk about this a little bit further on. So this is the website. It's at nenufar.umanum.fr. And in the next few slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how it's structured and the kinds of features that you can find, but you're welcome to access the website as I'm going through the different features of which are available. So here, for example, the website gives you the option of actually choosing for each of the entries on the side panel. You can actually choose which edition to look at. But then if you click on the Historique tab, you can actually compare the different editions. And so the parts of the text which have changed over the different editions are actually highlighted here. It's kind of interesting, especially when it comes to a word like aviation, where you can actually see how they had to update the entry on the basis of the kind of the latest discoveries and the latest technologies. And here, for example, is another word, Bolshevik, and each of the entries on the website has this kind of note at the bottom, which basically describes the changes which the entry underwent over the course of the various different editions. And in this case, for example, you can read that the entry first appeared in the dictionary in 1921. In the 1921 edition, sorry, and then it stopped, it wasn't included in the 1925 edition, But then below, there's a little bit of an explanation as to why, and that's because it was actually fused with another entry. And so this kind of information is available for each of the entries. And also the number 177 actually refers to the reprint number, so it's very thorough. And if you click on the Resources tab, you can actually also find the original scans. And so far as I know, we've got the editions from 1906 up to 1925, and my colleagues in Montpellier are working on key editions for the 1930s and the 1940s. So now I'm going to give you briefly look at the TI encoding of helicopter. And as I said, we try to follow the TI Lexio recommendations as closely as possible. And here the N attribute actually gives, you can actually read off the fact that the entry remained unchanged between the 1906 and the 1925 editions. And then there's also, for example, an expansion of the grammatical abbreviations. And this is based on the list of abbreviations at the beginning of each edition. But we're also planning to add an identifier from a category register or controlled vocabulary as well. And then here's a sense with a definition. Okay, so when it comes to encoding print dictionaries, structured lexical resources, two of the most popular formats or data models are undoubtedly, but you might want to argue with this, TI and RDF. And I say this mainly because these are the two target formats currently being used in eLexis. And each of these two formats has its own advantages and disadvantages. However, because we had chosen to work with both of them, we decided we would think in terms of a division of labour and focus on what each of these two formats did best. So obviously we used Ontolex Lemon to encode the dictionary, and this is the core model I'm sure you've probably seen several times throughout the course of the last few days. So our starting point was the TI encoding of the various different editions of Le Petit Larousse Illustré. And so basically I wrote a Python script in order to carry out the conversion. And it was fairly easy to map elements such as entry, sense, gram, group, form to their Ontolex equivalents. And we also made use of the Lexinfo vocabulary in order to represent different linguistic data categories, such as part of speech. But, however, in the case of elements such as def, note, and etim, which are actually used to encode important information in the TI representation of the dictionary, there wasn't anything that we could use that already existed, so we had to create our own classes and properties. So one kind of big decision which we made was to represent the various different editions as one graph rather than creating one separate graph per edition. And this was really to save, because otherwise it would have been too redundant, because even though the editions change, a lot of the information remains the same. So what we decided to do was to model each separate edition of Le Petit Larousse Illustré as an OWL individual of type PLI dictionary. And then we would associate individual lexical entries with with one of these individuals. And this is to represent the fact that this version of the entry of an entry appears in these editions. And then we link together the different versions of a lexical entry using the Dublin core properties has version and is version of. And in addition, we not only link together different versions of an entry, but we also link together the parts of the entry that actually change across editions. So for instance, if a sense changes, then we'll actually link together the two different versions of that sense. Hopefully this will become clearer. I'm going to show you an example. So I'll briefly go over what the RDF version looks like. So as you can see, we have we have PLI Lexicon, which is the graph which contains all the different entries, all the different versions of the entries. And then we have all the different kind of source editions, and I think we've reached 1924, as far as I know at the moment. And then, for example, here I've put the entry for whiskey, the first version of the entry for whiskey in the dictionary, which appears in the editions from 1906 up till 1909. And as you can see, you have an entry which is part of a lexicon, but then you have also this extra information which tells you which actual version of the lexicon that entry appears in. So here's a turtle version of that diagram. So you can see that you have your lexical entry and you have all the editions in which it appears. And then here, for example, you have the link between Whiskey 1 and Whiskey 2. So far, we only have two versions of the Whiskey entry. And here we have them side by side. So this is the first version of the Whiskey entry. This is the second version. It actually should be Scotland, not Angleterre. And you can see that basically I've also linked together the two different definitions, because in this case it's the definition which changes. So even though I've also put, you don't see it here, but the version of link between the two different entries, I've also put it between the has version and this version of. I've also put it between the dictionary definition which changes. And the dictionary definition is a class which we defined because I don't think there was anything that we thought was appropriate, did what we wanted it to do in this situation. So a small sample of the entries that we've already encoded up to this point can be found at the following address. However, we plan to have tentative or kind of speranza, as they say in Italian, is to have the whole data set available in RDF for 2021. And we also plan to add links from definitions and notes and etymologies, which reference named entities, to other resources such as DBpedia, which also represent these entities. So, thank you for listening, and this is the rundown of who did what in the project. So, thank you.
Okay, so we have lots of time for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Fahad, for your interesting talk. At one point you mentioned that you were even able to detect the merger of entries. How? So basically you mentioned that one of the entries is no longer present in a later edition due to it being merged with another entry, if I understood you correctly.
Bolshevist, I think, yeah.
So how could you detect such mergers?
How did I go about detecting this?
Yes, because it's easy to detect that an entry is no longer there in a next edition, right? You can say, well, the head word wasn't there anymore, for example. But you've been able to also indicate whether it was even merged with another entry.
Because that was my colleague, Hervé, that actually carried out that part, so I'm not sure how he actually did it, and I wouldn't want to make something up on the spot. But I assume he had kind of a set of heuristics which he used, I guess so. But if we can email him or...
I can answer quickly. This is very simple because, first, Hervé, I think he knows all the editions of the dictionary by heart, so it helps a lot. But he's really doing listings of the existing lemmas, comparing from one edition to the other. And when a word disappears, he's tracking the word also in the further edition to see whether they appear as sub-entries or in definitions and so on. So he's got some kind of systematic routines to actually trace the words over the editions. Yeah.
Sounds very interesting. I'll look further into it then and get in touch.
Thank you, Laurent.
Okay, do we have some more questions? No? Okay. So, so you're using RDF and TEI. So does this mean that then, if you're browsing it, every entry is available as both TEI and RDF, or is it a case that there is some kind of I mean, is all information represented in both formats, or is there some kind of overlap where there's some information you only get from TI and some you can only get from the RDF and the Ontilex, or?
Well, I think the point is that some of the information is kind of, all of the information is there implicit in the TI because we start off with the TI encoding, but then in terms of explicitly representing that information using kind of different properties which have their own semantics and really structuring that information in a way that makes it more accessible, I think you can do that in a way which I guess is probably more amenable to like automatic processing and in RDF rather than TI. But yeah, so in that sense, some of the information that's in the TI, and maybe it's not structured, maybe it's just there as text, is actually made explicit in the RDF. And actually we're working on trying to understand how much of that information we want to make explicit and how different the two different versions should be. But essentially, yes, all the information should be at least implicit in the TI, but not necessarily explicitly annotated for, I guess. That's more to do with like the difference between the two models as well. Okay. That satisfies you. But it's very experimental, so we're still kind of finding our way, to be honest.
Okay, that's very interesting. If there's no further questions, then we'll thank our speaker. Okay. Yeah, the slides up. Okay, so we'll start with the final talk of this session. So Xander Stork is going to talk to us about Old English's linguistic linked open data.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here with this last talk of the day. And I'm sure there's another workshop still to attend for those who are wishing to and eager to go on after this. But I'm glad for this many attendance for my talk. So my paper's context is a project that has been titled Exploring Anglo-Saxon Eloquence, basically exploring the language and culture of the early medieval English people. So we will be exploring the use of what is known now as linguistic linked data for exploring this language and culture of this specific people on this variant of English, and that's a project embedded and researched in many different institutions, amongst which my own university, University of Leiden, but also King's College London, Institution of the Dutch Language, University of Groningen, and University of Glasgow, amongst others. So there's a wider reach than what I'll be presenting today, and I'll get you some more information on that later as well. But the topic for today will be the porting of thesauri to linguistic linked data. So working with thesaurus, these lexicographic resources that are very valuable to explore, in my case, Old English. So I'm working here with a thesaurus of Old English. Now, the outline for my talk is to first give you a brief introduction to what is this lexicographic resource called a thesaurus of Old English, and then to describe how we got from the digital format that already exists, which I refer to here as the legacy form, to the linguistic linked data form, and how did I give that shape, that conversion process, and to provide you also for future work for other thesauri, provide some recommendations and notes for further resources in the future for similar processes. So a thesaurus of Old English, for those of you who are not familiar with this resource, is basically a thesaurus, there you go, of Old English. There you go, it's that easy. So Old English is the early medieval variant of English, spoken roughly between 500 and 1100 AD. This was when the Germanic peoples flooded in and took control over this, this island, and basically started speaking the Germanic language there instead of some Gaelic and other languages that be. The editors of this specific thesaurus were Jane Roberts, Christian Kay, and Lynn Grundy, and they published their efforts in a book in 1995 for the first edition, with a revised edition in 2000, and you can see the numbers adding up, 95, 2000, 2005, a website. So they did a 5-yearly update, let's say, on this resource. Quite nice, right? But they haven't yet gotten to linguistic linked data. So that's where this effort of these institutions together are looking into in this Exploring Anglo-Saxon Eloquence project to see whether this new digital form can be of help in connecting it up with other information and doing research on it. Well, the first step is, of course, then to see whether we can even get it to that format. Now, I first wanted to present with you an example or a sample of content of the thesaurus of Old English. So, a thesaurus is basically, for most of you will be familiar with this, but basically consists out of a hierarchy of concepts that become increasingly specific in its meaning. This thesaurus has 20,000 of those, for those who are into numbers. And then stating at a certain level of this hierarchy or this tree structure, which lexical items, so which words were available to express that. So in Old English, for freedom, for example, we have the words freols and freot. Sounds nice. But next to just knowing which words were available for that and were roughly synonymous with each other, there's also some extra information, such as, of course, the part of speech, but also some flags indicating whether it was available only in glosses that have come down to us, or also in poetical text, for instance. So there are some extra distribution flags in this thesaurus. From legacy to linked. So what is the legacy digital form that has been used for the website that I indicated in 2005 before we're going to the linked data form? It's basically a tabular MySQL database which consists out of 3 tables, and I'll quickly go through these together, these 3 tables. The first basically captures this hierarchy of categories, right, or concepts. And looks as follows. It has a few columns, of which the first just identifies which category is there. Then we see a few columns, T1 to T7, and subcats. And these are basically indications of the location in the hierarchy. So is it branch number 1, for instance, or in the highlighted one, branch number 12, followed by branch number 1, followed by branch number 1, followed by branch number 10, etc., right? Maybe a bit unlucky is the choice for official references to use these locations. So instead of using a reference of the category ID number that is stable, even though in future editions the location of a category might change a bit towards another branch or be specialized further down the branch, it's been used, this location taxonomy has been used to identify the category in official references in public scholarly work. So we have 2 different kinds of identification mechanisms here in place. Part of speech indicated for what kind of words can we expect in this branch or this specific position, including the modern English heading, right? So this is the word or meaning that we would first look up and then see which early medieval English words were available there. The second table basically allows for cross-references between these concepts or categories. If you're interested in this particular meaning, look into this other branch as well. According to the editors, at least, they would say that these are nice to look into. So here we have a few cross-references, again, with their own identifier for each particular cross-reference, XID, and then 2 references to a category, the cat ID and the ref ID, both stating, hey, this is if you're looking into this specific category or concept, then please look at this other one in the ref ID. TNUM, again, here we see that unlucky or unfortunate location string encoding for where do we reference to. So this is actually the same as the ref ID, just stated in another way, if that makes sense. Right, so a bit of a superfluous information there because we can also get that elsewhere. The third table encodes or captures the lexical items, the words and their attributes, let's say. So again, each entry gets its own ID, right? LID in this case. And states under which category does it fall. In this case, 1718-9 for Vreels, and that's the category for freedom that we saw earlier. It captures some more information, such as which word should be presented before which other word. And I think this is mainly something that has been done to cope with the fact that Anglo-Saxon spelling had a few symbols that we're not very familiar with from A to Z. There were some runic symbols in there that would not translate to our TH directly in recognition. So they tried to cope with this fact, right? So where do we put something starting with a runic symbol? Well, it should start at the T, for instance. So this is how they try to encode that there. Some notes and these distribution flags that I've mentioned. So is it part of the P flag, for instance? Is it part of only poetic texts? Is it only found in glossaries, etc.? So how do we go from this to a linked form, a linguistic linked data form? Well, if we take that first sample, the mapping is actually relatively straightforward. We can say that these categories kind of coincide or reflect lexical concepts. We can say that these words are actually words in a specific sense because they're located at a certain concept, a certain expression of meaning. So there are lexical senses that kind of lexicalize or express that category. So using OntoLex, COS, and lemon tree and other vocabulary, these kinds of elements could be translated to linguistic linked data in a very easy manner, I would say. Or at least mostly so, because of course there are exceptions. So I wanted to discuss these with you as well, because they might be of interest for future endeavors that try a similar thing. One such exception is that some information is editorial or superseded. So I've got here one example, and that is the etymological notes and notes, other editorial notes. These are, according to the editors of the Thesaurus of Old English, meant not for public consumption. So vetoing their publication, as it were, in any form. So this is something that I am also not supposed, of course, and in our team, to bring over into a linguistic linked data form. This was merely meant for editorial purposes. Another one is the category identification. So how should we identify categories? In linguistic linked data as well, and in linked data in general, each bit of information is identified with a URI. So identification is we try to pin to one specific element, let's say. And here we find this two different systems of identification by location in the taxonomy. Even though that's not a necessity, you do not really need to encode the location, and the identification. So that means that, for instance, just saying which concept is a subordinate concept to another, so where does this actually hierarchy come from? In this case, it's only deducible by getting that string of what's the location in the branch, and then reducing the last part, taking the last part out of it to see, hey, what was the category that lies on top of it? This is kind of an indirect way of stating this is the hierarchy. And this could have been done easier, of course, by just saying, hey, the superordinate or the higher lying category has the category ID 1721, for instance, right? Would have been a bit easier, but this means that the mapping had to take that into account. And there's some ambiguity in what a lexeme is. So, for instance, there is information that is based on the level of a sense, because a certain word is located at a certain category, because it's in a certain sense. So there's some information based on that. For instance, in which category it's located, right here. But also, there's some information that's actually transcendent of senses, and those are actually the flags. So the editors of the thesaurus have said that, for instance, if a word occurs in just poetic texts, they're not looking just at senses. They will flag it regardless of which sense it's in. But they still have encoded that for a specific place within this taxonomy of the thesaurus. So even if, let's say, vreels, that also means freedom, would also mean something else, then they would use the same flag information, saying that, well, regardless of just jumbling them together, they are only found in poetic texts, period. Or they are only found in glosses. But they record that for each separate location, which of course gives rise to possibility of conflicts, which there are some, not many, but there are some. So these are some of the difficulties that have been encountered. I'd like to quickly talk about the conversion process as well, if I may. There is some time, I see. Yes. Because here I've tried to make sure that the way of going from the traditional format, the legacy format, to the linguistic linked data form follows a very easy process that separates two concerns. The first step is namely to express the structure of these tables in linked data, but non-linguistic linked data. So basically saying, hey, we're now creating a graph, just saying, hey, this is a row and it has these and these and these attributes. Hey, this is a row and this has these and these attributes. This means that you can have a very generic parser here for just saying, hey, it's a table, and this is the table, but now in a graph form. I don't need anything very specific to do the entire mapping in one go, and I could have had another tabular structure, another processor to first go to this form, right? So whether it's Excel or any other tabular form, we could still get to this point without the interpretation and trying to add that in the same program. So creating those two steps just to make sure that that tooling can handle first one simple step and can be reused more often, and then later on another can take care of the interpretation. So the interpretation is then done using a language or querying language very specific to linked data and very standardized. So there are many tools that can handle this. So that again makes sure that the dependency on a single tool is reduced significantly. So basically what this does is we're saying whenever you find this structural pattern in the graph, right, these rows and with these and these attributes, then infer or construct, as it states on the right, then construct this and this linguistic linked data pattern. So running that nets us the result that we have been looking forward to, right? So this is just a simple two-step process, basically. There's more detail in the paper if you're interested. Concluding, so with this case study, we have shown that topical thesauri can indeed be ported to the semantic web, and the expressivity of some of these vocabularies are very good, aligned with the needs basically for thesauri, onto Lex, Scos, and Lemon Tree specifically. The conversion process can be relatively straightforward, but of course there are always caveats with superseded information, editorial information, those kinds of exceptions that I've been mentioning. But it is possible to, as I mentioned here, to separate that translation of format and meaning. Don't try to do these two things at the same time. Basically, it might help you find the right tooling for the right job and reuse those. So recommendations for such future endeavors would be to first see if there's the same alignment with the linguistic linked data terminology and your source content, what exceptions are there, and try to use use a standardized language to capture your mapping, simply to make sure that everybody can reduce that dependency on a single tool, and or allow people to not just review very specific tools, but see that mapping and compare it to other mappings that are out there, for instance. Result and future work. So this is the afterwards. So this is basically done. We've managed to create this. There's an application online in which you can browse this and see these identifiers used for each specific bit of information. Feel free to explore it. It's online. The project, as mentioned, will have a few case studies. So there are 12 papers being prepared for a workshop in Leiden on the 8th of June. So if you're interested in electronic lexicographic resources, seeing them in linguistic linked data and seeing what that could mean or could do for use of these materials, and for, in this case, researching a language and culture that it encodes, the registration for this international conference of English historical linguistics is going to be open in a few months, but let me know if you're interested and I'll make sure to give you a heads up when it does. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions. Yes, let's see.
Yes, thank you very much. My question was simply, I missed the part. Is this also open source and free resource so that one can, for instance, apply your functions for semantics?
So the Thesaurus of Old English is owned by the University of Glasgow, so I'm not allowed to open that fully up apart from the conversion process is something that I will be opening up, however, so that everybody could reuse that or look into it. I haven't put that online yet, but the link in the paper, in the full paper, will provide you with a link, and I will make sure to have that up there next week so that you can have a look at these resources of how can that mapping be done.
Yes, because this is how I can show the stuff to our coders that are interested in the press.
I can imagine, yes. I'll make those available. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay, do we have some more questions? So maybe just a bit of a clarification. So how are you handling spelling normalization? Is the spelling already normalized in your source material, or is this something you have to deal with in how you publish it and how you build a thesaurus?
So it's already been normalized to some extent. So what the editors of this thesaurus have done is to basically use other existing dictionaries and rearrange it to a hierarchical structure according to meaning. And by doing so, they've actually used the normalization process that others in other dictionaries have already established. So they've been typically been using these headwords that already are used in other dictionaries that people were familiar with, and use that as the normalized form, let's say. Yeah.
And have you considered linking it to other thesauri, like, for example, DBpedia?
Not yet, and I think the main reason is that for these case studies that I've been talking about, that we're planning, is that most of the people involved are based in the humanities. So they are not so much familiar yet with the possibilities of exploring resources that are, how should I put this, further than the traditional book. But they are familiar with how they can add extra information or provide extra insights without even adding DBpedia, etc. to it. But I think that's a topic for exploring more with either digital humanities scholars, indeed, or with the likes of yourself. So if you're interested, John, let me know.
Okay. I have a question?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you know if any of this work is being done on other references for Old English.
Other
reference works in Old English, like the Dictionary of Old English or others. Yeah.
For Old English, not towards linked data, you mean, or not so much. So this is the philology section, let's put it like that, is not has been mainly looking at the text themselves and using dictionaries only to look up a word and then translating it themselves, right? So it's a very traditional field, let's say. So using these kinds of tools to add a lens to it and doing some computational work related to it is relatively new for the field. So I'm trying to ease them in as well using the application UI and see whether that can help them to get their heads around it. What is linked data even? What can it do for us? Adding information, making these connections, and hopefully again also indeed DBpedia later on as well. But getting all these links in and seeing what they can do for them and expanding their minds in that sense. So this workshop that's been planned is also there to inspire others, inspire themselves as well, and see what other approaches can be done for this field. Thanks for your question.
Okay, if there's not another question, then I will thank our speaker again. And that brings a close to